Hi, everyone. I'm producing a second recording of today's webinar, thanks to my engineer husband, Greg, who's doing the recording for me. I wanted you to have a clear and audible version of today's webinar since there was so much glitchiness with the audio. So I want to provide the same context that I did this morning for my first slide. And that is that I've been an educator for the past 2.5 decades, focused on optimizing experience for young people. And then I had an experience with my mother's death that really set me on this course of optimizing experience for folks at the other end of the life cycle. I became a hospice volunteer and fully expected that this practice would be an expansion of that type of accompaniment of individuals and their families through the dying process. But what I discovered as I started to workshop my business model is that there's a significant gap in people's abilities to think about end of life, much less talk about it and much less plan for it. So that's the context for this first slide. So sorry, here we go. So while commonly folks do their financial and retirement planning, their estate planning well ahead of times of crisis, they leave out a significant portion of planning, and that's what I'm going to be talking with you about. We do the financial and estate planning because we want to be comfortable, we want to take care of our loved ones, we don't want to rely on them if we don't need to. But what gets missed is that slice of planning for that particular segment of time when inevitably we do rely on others for our care and or our decision making. Many folks do their advanced care health directives, which is a very important portion of end-of-life planning. But what that does not do is it doesn't prepare the designee, the holder of power of attorney that's conveyed by the healthcare directive. It doesn't prepare that designee for the emotional and cognitive load that often accompany times of crisis and end-of-life situations. And that's where the gap is that I'm trying to address. So before we move on, I'd like to have you respond and do a self-assessment. I think that'll clarify where you are in this process. So as I read each prompt, just answer in your head, yes, no, maybe, I don't know. My loved ones and my physician know that what my end-of-life wishes are and why I've made them. My loved ones and my physician understand my definition of quality of life. I'm confident that my healthcare agent, person who holds power of attorney, will easily make decisions that are aligned with mine, even in an emergency or crisis. I'm confident that my loved ones will be able to support my wishes without conflict or hesitation, even in an emergency or crisis. So what research tells us is that 92% of Americans think it's important to have conversations regarding end of life with their loved ones. But in fact, only 32% of Americans actually have conversations regarding these end of life decisions. So if you answered no, or maybe, or I don't know to those prompts, you are in the majority. I find this next statistic rather surprising and staggering. So 50% of Americans will participate in their own end-of-life decisions, but 50% of Americans will not participate in their own end-of-life decisions. So let's talk about the objectives of the kind of end-of-life planning processes that I'm trying to address. They increase the likelihood that our decisions will be implemented with care and fidelity. The processes build confidence and understanding in those who will be stewarding our wishes. And they reduce worry, uncertainty, and potential for conflict. Potential for conflict is actually a kind of normal and natural thing. People come to these situations with different personalities, different relationships with their loved ones. And so oftentimes, even though there's not conflict or disagreement under normal circumstances, the level of concern and anxiety can bring on some potential disagreements. And so these processes actually help anticipate those and plan for them. The benefits of this type of planning is that you can avoid unnecessary emotional distress for your loved ones. It assures values-based decision-making. And what I mean by this is that decisions are really anchored to what a person values most. When we drill down to the core values that undergird decisions, it explains those decisions to people who will be implementing them. And in times of crisis, returning to our loved ones' core values is really a stabilizing force. These processes offer us the opportunity to clarify quality of life long before it closes. And this can impact decisions when you have a lot of life to live. And with all good planning, as with all good planning, an outcome is a sense of resolution and peace of mind. So this is not, these are not check the box, one size fits all processes. They are tailored, person-centered. They get at what's most important to the person involved. As I mentioned, we drill down into the definition of what quality of life is. That may mean things to do with our environment or relationships or interactions or actions. When we drill down to the why, these things that are important to us become evident to others because we've explained the reason behind them. So it really helps folks to act on our decisions. They understand the context and the significance of them. A really good sort of rough but simple example of this has to do, for example, with artificial feeding. So if I know that Tutu defines quality of life as being able to tell her grandchildren that she loves them, being able to hum along when someone's playing ukulele in the room, I might be able to make the decision to actually execute her decision to suspend artificial feeding. This is often difficult for families because withholding food and watching someone wither from lack of food is quite hard. But again, in this situation, because I understand how that decision to provide food will compromise Tutu's end-of-life wishes, it makes it a little bit easier to make a tough decision like that, or to uphold a tough decision like that. Because remember, these decisions are already made. We're just trying to steward them. These processes also consider patterns and the processes for medical decision-making in our family, even how we handle difficult news. And this is really about anticipation. And any good planning exercise anticipates what's coming ahead so that you can design for it, circumvent some of the potholes. As attorneys, I'm sure you understand this very well. And lastly, the aim of these processes are really to land on language that has meaning and impact for our loved ones, the folks who will be stewarding our wishes, as well as for the medical teams who help us navigate between what can be done medically and what should be done. So this is a tagline that I borrow from the Conversation Project, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. We often put off this kind of end-of-life planning because it feels burdensome or grievous. And so it goes undone until the opportunity to do it is gone. And at that point, we're only able to react. And there's a very different, reacting to something has a very different quality than responding to something that you've planned for. The thing is, there's some really, really practical tools, which are coming up. I'm going to share them with you, that normalize this kind of planning, that make it accessible and very, very easy to do. The other thing I want to say about it is that many of these processes really focus much more on life and living than they do on dying. So these are good opportunities to talk about a life well lived, and then ultimately arrive at decisions that will offer the kind of close of life that you envision for yourself. So the first tool that I want to share with you is something called the Conversation Project. Please note the website. This is an initiative of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. The Institute for Healthcare Improvement is a 30-year-old organization that partners with organizations and leaders in healthcare to reform healthcare policy and to advance both health and health care. So Conversation Project is one of their more robust initiatives. And what it does is it offers tools that are really focused on communication. And communication is really at the core of this type of end-of-life planning that I'm talking about. I spoke earlier about the healthcare directive. That completes the planning. What it doesn't address is the this notion of communication, which helps solidify the confidence of the folks who are actually going to be stewarding the wishes indicated in the directive. So the Conversation Project offers a framework for thinking about what to talk about, for tips for having the conversation, and planning it well so that it's easy and comfortable. And then it even provides sort of nuts and bolts for after you have the conversation. So I will say that this tool differs quantitatively from the next tool in that it focuses largely on healthcare decisions. It's not better or worse, they're just different, and both offer really, really substantive experiences with regard to end-of-life planning. So, but this one is really, really clearly about about providing staged incremental tools towards having a plan and then being able to communicate that plan. And I highly recommend it. The next tool is the Stanford Letter Project. This was a tool devised by a doctor at Stanford Med whose research found that by and large, doctors were not having conversations with their patients about end of life, in spite of the fact that they acknowledged the importance of doing so. This is qualitatively different from the Conversation Project in that it is a series of questions. It's not sort of this, scaffolded approach. It's a series of questions, which I'm actually going to share with you in the next slide. And it has a more holistic outcome in that it asks questions about living and about things that matter most in life before it gets to the questions around patterns in your family and the healthcare decisions themselves. Once again, I recommend this as highly as I do the other. Please feel free to explore both because different people find different tools accessible. And I wanted to give you a choice. The outcomes of both are solid and provide good documents and that can be communicated to loved ones and to caregivers. So let me show you. Oh, and I'm sorry, I've noted here another website at the bottom of this slide, Kokua Mau. It's a nonprofit here in Hawaii that it's a really, really rich, robust site. They have a lot of resources that help folks with writing advanced directives, and I highly recommend them. They archive a lot of good webinars and a lot of good education they do in the community. So here are some sample prompts and some sample potential responses to those prompts in the What Matters Most process. I'm going to give you some time to read through them for just a few moments here. So what's lovely about this process is that it can really yield rich and meaningful information, mostly in the form of stories. I highly recommend that if you choose this tool, that you do it in partnership with someone, that they interview you or that you converse about these responses. So I use an adaptation of this in my interviews with clients, and I'll give you an example. So if someone said, you know, what matters most to me is that I love to garden. I will ask them, how did you learn to garden? When did you start gardening? Did you ever garden with anyone special in your life? I'll probe deeper so that it's not just a series of bullets. When we tend to do these kinds of exercises on our own, we write short sentences, phrases, quick paragraphs, if that. And so, but when you do this in conversation or in interview setting with someone close to you, you really dredge up these beautiful stories, which are the things that really, really resonate. They sort of shine with your values, lessons learned, what's important to you, and they really, really resonate with loved ones, caregivers. As you see around the, I spoke about this process also clarifying quality of life such that it impacts current life decisions. And I will tell you that I have gone through this process with clients, and they have, at the end of the process, come to different decisions about how they spend their resources, or where they spend their time, or with whom they spend their time, because we do this while there's still a lot of living to be done. And so doing this, going through this reflective process well ahead of crisis, allows folks to come to some clarity, which is quite crystalline, about how they want to spend the time that they have while life is full. You'll also see that this takes us through thinking about how our family processes news and processes difficult decisions. Once again, it's really good to do this ahead of time, because those patterns tend to surface in times of crisis. They can even become difficult in times of crisis, when there's a high emotional quotient, when anxiety is running high. And it's so much more helpful to anticipate those potential hiccups ahead of time, because they can be planned for and often resolved. So I'll say it again and again that communication is the key here. Part of the process is definitely writing things down, but the other very important part is talking while you're doing it and after you've done it. We tend to think that if we write something down, it's going to happen, but the writing itself, the writing in and of itself, does not prepare folks for the actions. It's the conversations that stem from the writing that are the real planning. And I think you, as attorneys, know better than anyone that writing things down does not always ensure that what's written is going to be executed. So I always ask my clients to respond to these questions, and these are things that you should answer for yourself once you've completed the process. What do my loved ones, caregivers, and/or physicians need to understand in order to steward my wishes with understanding and confidence? With whom do I need to communicate ahead of time? And are there matters that need to be resolved to ensure that my wishes will be met and that my loved ones, caregivers, and/or medical team can proceed without conflict? Really critical that those questions, that you spend some time answering those questions and taking appropriate action. I thought it might be helpful to capture again here a couple of the questions that I remember from today's webinar. I'm sorry I don't remember them all, but there are a couple that stand out. The first one had to do with talking to kupuna about topics like this, when you know, we may be come from a sort of reserved, cautious culture when it comes to end of life, and or sometimes it's just hard to talk to our elders about this because we don't want them to feel, or they sometimes feel compromised, and we don't want to um, uh, curb their enthusiasm or have them think that we think they're on their way out or anything like that. So my recommendation is to do a couple of things. One, to start from a place of care and to couch things in the most positive language possible. So instead of saying something like, Dad, you're really dangerous on the road. I really need to take away your car keys. You can shift that very, very easily by saying, Dad, you drove me around all my life. I'm so thankful. You kept me safe. You taught me how to drive. And now I feel really, really responsible for your safety. So I want to talk to you about, about driving and when it'll be appropriate for you to stop. Let's talk about, how safe you feel. So there are two things that I just illustrated in that approach. One is starting from a place of care, and the other is assuming that you're not going to arrive at a solution immediately, that you may have to do this incrementally, that you may have to have a couple of conversations. It may take a week, it may take a month. Dad's been living this way for a long time, and he's not going to change with the flip of a switch. So I'll give you another example of couching in this kind of conversation in care. Mom, you've kept me safe all your life, and I want to be sure that you're safe and comfortable throughout yours. You've given me so many things to be happy about, and I want to talk about life from here on in, so that I know what makes you happy, what makes you comfortable, and that's very different from saying, Mom, we got to make sure that you don't fall down at home, right? It's very, very different. I can see my husband giving me some prompts. Some example. Oh, these are some other questions. These remembered from the webinar today. So I'll go to this one. Some examples of success stories with clients. Two came to mind this morning, and I'll share those with you again. The first was an experience I had with a client and I met with the clients as a couple, and their family members joined because there's an option to do that. And there was some consternation from the family members that Dad had made this decision about how he was going to spend resources on a particular project. And they weren't going to argue with him. They knew he could afford it. They just really didn't think that it was the best way for him to spend this rather significant amount of money. Throughout the process, the family members just listened, and Mom and Dad went through the process talking about what they valued, why. And interestingly, through this process of introspection, about 2/3 of the way through the interview, Dad said, I just realized something. I realized that I'm trying to chase away this fear of my life closing. And that's why I'm so, dead set on spending this money this way. But I don't feel that need anymore, thinking about what's truly, truly important to me. And he made a decision to shift those resources to other things that made so much more sense to both him and his spouse and to his family members. So that's one great example. Another example that came to mind was when I was working with a couple. Once again, I met with them together, and it was interesting because they were conferring power of attorney in their healthcare directive to someone outside the family. It was a professional connection, not a familial connection. They had kids, but did not feel that they wanted to give that responsibility to their children. So I asked the question, are you concerned about ill feelings or worry or conflict at end of life when your children find out that they have nothing to do with your care? And they said, oh, I don't think so. We don't have they're far away. They live their own lives. I just don't anticipate they'll care at all. And I said, well, things change when it's a life and death situation. When you're losing a loved one, mentioned this emotional quotient that comes into play, and they started to think about it, and they could actually imagine that in that moment, one or both of their children would have misgivings about not being involved. And so what we did was we role played the conversation that they would have with their children with their planning document. And they had that conversation, and it went well, and I credit them for that. But that was another really good outcome. I think ill feelings and conflict averted in that case. Let's see, another question that Greg remembers is, how do I address the fear that talking about death will bring death? So the way I responded to this was, I think the way I understand this is this notion of bachi, right? It's not healthy, it's not safe to talk about it. And I'll say again that the processes, particularly the Stanford letter writing project, really focuses about life. So I think that starting with questions, and again, think about doing this over time. Doesn't all have to be in an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours or even a week. But starting conversations with loved ones about what, their lives, what lessons they've learned, what matters most to them. Talk about their influence on you. Ask them who their influences were. What are the things, that the values that they hold most dear, and why? Talk to them a lot about life. That is what the process takes you through. And as you start zeroing it, first of all, creating a safe atmosphere for having these conversations, right? It's a little bit easier gradually to say, gosh, now it's so clear to me what makes you happy, what makes you comfortable. I want to do everything I can to ensure that comfort and that happiness for as long as possible. As you age, I want to be sure that you're taking care of that in that way. So the way I respond to that nervousness about talking about death is I recommend that you start by talking about life, and do that for a good amount of time, until you can eventually get to this sort of foundation that you have, where you're trying to you're moving from the very, very concrete things about life, and can shift that into the more abstract, the abstraction of one's life closing. Another question is how I work with people. So what I do for everyone is offer a free consult. I spend 30 minutes at least, if not 45 minutes or longer, with folks who just have questions about what the process is, and about their own context. And it's really important. Some people walk through the door after that, and some people don't, and that's fine. My mission really is, of course, to educate people and to create an open door. But we really establish whether or not I can meet their needs, and if I can, how their needs are going to be met. But there's that consult, because this is not something that people are familiar with. Sorry, that was my husband's question. I don't think that came up in the webinar. And my email address, if you'd like to ask any further questions, is ppk@hi-path.co, ppk@hi-path.co. And I'll ask Desmond to put it in the email. So I hope I've recapped most of what we talked about today, with a little bonus from Greg, a little boost from Greg. So I really believe that this process is focused on living life fully and planning to close it well. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I'm so pleased to have been able to share this with you. Thanks very, very much for your attention.